Good morning. My name is Elaine Kmark, a senior fellow here in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. And we're here today to talk about a very topical subject: do debates matter? We are only one day away from the first presidential debate in one of the most intense and consequential presidential elections in our lifetime. So as we get ready to watch tomorrow night, we thought it would be good to do three things. First, we'll look back a bit at some of debate history, some of presidential debate history. Then we'll turn to two experts on debates: Kathleen Hall Jamieson, the renowned scholar from the University of Pennsylvania and one of the country's foremost experts on media and politics, and also founder of factcheck.org. And Rush Schrieffer, an experienced Republican strategist and media consultant who has worked in many presidential campaigns, including most recently the campaign of Mitt Romney in 2012. In our third segment, we'll take questions from the audience. You can submit questions in the chat function or via Twitter at #politics2020 or via events@brookings.edu. Let's have a look at the very first presidential debate between Kennedy and Nixon. Here is a picture of them that shows really the problem. The very first televised presidential debate was between these two men in 1960. And the idea didn't come from the candidates or the political parties, it came from the networks. Kennedy quickly accepted. Nixon, against the advice of many, also accepted. It is now widely thought that 1960 debate was a disaster for Nixon, who had been sick, who made no effort to cover up his 5 o'clock shadow, and who looked bad compared to the tan and rested Jack Kennedy. As you can see in this photograph, Nixon is wiping sweat from his face. Those who heard the debate on radio thought Nixon had won. Those who saw it on TV thought Kennedy had won. The first presidential debate showed the incredible impact of television and added a new requirement to presidential candidates, that they be telegenic. 16 years passed between the first and second debate in 1976, when President Gerald Ford agreed to debate Jimmy Carter. That debate, along with an amendment from the Communications Act, solidified the tradition and we have had debates ever since. It is not surprising that some of the greatest debate moments ever were had by candidate and then President Ronald Reagan, a former movie actor whose comfort in front of the cameras is legendary. But going into the fall campaign in 1980, Reagan and Carter were neck and neck in the polls. In the following clip from Reagan's 1980 debate against President Jimmy Carter, he asked the question that many think was responsible for his subsequent landslide victory: are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?
Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you'll vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
4 years later, President Reagan was running against Jimmy Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale. In his first debate, things didn't go so well. Reagan appeared old and confused in a performance that led many to wonder if he was too old for the job. But in his second debate, Reagan had a memorable comeback. Watch.
Mr. President, I want to raise an issue that I think has been lurking out there for 2 or 3 weeks and cast it specifically in national security terms. You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
In 1988, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis was running against Vice President George H.W. Bush. It was a close race, but Dukakis wasn't helped when, in the second debate, he gave the following answer to moderator Bernard Shaw. Watch and see if you can see what's missing there.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so in my own state, and it's one of the reasons why we have had the biggest drop in crime of any industrial state in America, why we have the lowest murder rate of any industrial state in America.
Michael Dukakis wasn't the only presidential candidate to look insufficiently empathetic in a debate. Have a look at this photo from the 1992 debate, when President Bush was caught checking his watch during an exchange with a woman who asked about the impact of the recession on him. Clinton's warm response came as a stark contrast to Bush's seeming indifference. Let's move on to the next photo, which shows that sometimes you don't need to say anything to hurt your debate performance. During the 2000 debate between Vice President Al Gore and Texas Governor George W. Bush, Gore, thinking the camera was not on him, grimaced and sighed loudly while Bush was talking. Saturday Night Live made merciless fun of him, as it has of many other politicians. And the satire, frankly, solidified the impression that Gore was just rude and arrogant. And in his 2016 debate against Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump repeatedly invaded her space, keeping the camera on him and his looming presence. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm back. Okay. I'm back with our two distinguished panelists after that little tour of previous presidential debates and highlights from those. And so I thought I'd start our discussion today with going to Russ. Russ, as you know, because you've been involved in them, as have I, right now, at this moment, presumably both Trump and Biden are seriously involved in something called debate prep. And so what is debate prep? I mean, can you tell the audience what happened?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, what's interesting is that debate prep starts, and I'd say this sort of in a normal campaign and in normal years, in normal times. Debate prep starts often literally months in advance, where the candidate will get his team together and start thinking about what questions could possibly be asked and what answers would they want to put together and give. I've been involved with a couple of debate preps where a candidate has literally had a notebook with a question and then their answer specifically laid out in that notebook, and they want to memorize their answer specifically. That often starts sometimes 2-3 months in advance. I remember President Bush, particularly in the 2000 campaign, started quietly preparing for debates as early as June. That there was sort of secret debate prep sessions with a very, very small number of people to get him kind of prepped for these debates, because he realized and knew that it was going to be a big deal and something that he needed to perform well with. As you get closer, you start to have back and forth sessions with a staff where they'll throw questions out and try to get you to think on your feet quickly and take news of the day and headlines of the day and try to throw them at you. And then as you get to sort of the week before, you'll have literally mock debate sessions where you find someone to play your opponent. Back with Mitt Romney in 2012, Rob Portman was playing Barack Obama, and in the vice presidential debate, Ted Olson was playing Joe Biden, which was a great choice. It was very interesting. And these mock debates can be as specific as you want. I mean, some of them can be just sort of around a kitchen table or around a big, conference table. But in some cases, you literally recreate a set. You have the podiums exactly the distance that they're going to be, exactly the height. You try to create game day situations. You have someone to play the moderator or moderators in the debate. And you do a full run through for the hour and a half with no breaks, no stops, and then come back and critique the performance afterwards. Dick Cheney famously would want to have rehearsals at the exact same time that the debate would be occurring. So he would have, if the debate was going to occur at 8 o'clock at night, he would want to have a full run through at 8 o'clock at night. And in fact, there was probably no one as more disciplined in the way he approached debate prep than Vice President Cheney was, both in 2000 and the 2004 campaign. Romney was a little bit of both. He liked to kind of sit around and have conversations about his policy and potential answers to questions. But when it came time to have a game day situation, there was very, very serious mock debates moving into the sessions. That's what normally happens. Other candidates just want to sit around and kind of toss questions out. Other candidates, there's no discipline into who's in the room. Our experience is that a small number of people is a much better debate than a large group. I've been in debate sessions where there's 15 plus people in the room. And if you, as you know, anytime you get 15 or more people in a room with a presidential candidate, everybody has to be the smartest person in the room, and everybody has to tell the candidate exactly how to answer the question, even if it's been already answered and it was answered well. So, these wind up becoming not particularly productive, and I've seen candidates literally kick everybody out and then reestablish a debate practice maybe an hour later with a much smaller core of like maybe 3 or 4 people. The other thing that we kind of like to start thinking about is then the kind of the strategy of the debate. What kind of debate do you want? And we always kind of phrase it in terms of, do you want a hot debate or a cold debate? A hot debate is when you want, and generally if you're behind, you might want to be very aggressive with your opponent. You might want to try to get your opponent to into a forced error, an unforced error. A cool debate, you're ahead. You really don't want anything to happen. You want the news headlines the next day to be candidates debate. Candidates mix it up in Cleveland. I mean, those are the kind of headlines that cool debates kind of give you. Hot debates usually wind up having an outcome that can possibly change some votes, even if it is just temporarily, and helps you kind of with the 3 to 5 days of the news cycle moving forward.
I've also heard over the years that sometimes the presidential candidates, if the stand-in opponent is doing a really good job, the candidate gets really mad at them and says because they're so in the role, right? Paul Begala played George Bush in the debate prep I was in with Al Gore, and Al Gore got really mad at him. Like, Paul, how could you say these things to me? And of course, Paul was being George Bush. So absolutely. And they start. We had a session once. I won't say who the candidate was, where we literally had to take a break, and the candidate walked out of the room.
And we had to kind of start like a half an hour later, and everybody had to say they were sorry, and we apologized, and we kind of went back into it again.
Exactly. Kathleen, you wrote a book about this a long time ago. You keep writing about media and politics and communications. Where does the mastery of the medium come in a presidential debate?
A lot of people cite, as you did in your opening, the 1960 example where the presumption is there was an advantage for Nixon in radio, disadvantage in television, and the reverse for Kennedy. One of the things that we need to say from a scholarly standpoint is the study that shows that was so small, in academic terms, so underpowered that it actually can't establish that. But this is one of those things where intuitively it just seems to be true. You look at the debates and you listen to the debates, and what you see is something that's important about how humans process information. The visuals through which we communicate, the demeanor that you can see, the tone of voice that you can hear, are all communicating things beyond what you can see in the debate transcript. And so to the extent that they are consistent with a message that says competent, shares my values, trustworthy, that's beneficial for the candidate. Also, because television and because debates in general are not heard, they're seen, and they're rarely just simply read, television as a medium has a capacity to do you in as a candidate. So if you look at the dual screening, the split screening with Trump and with Clinton in 2016, Trump knows he's on camera in split screen. He's grimacing, he's nodding, he's scowling. He's drawing attention away from Hillary Clinton's answers. That's distracting. It's also reframing. You saw it inadvertently in the 1960 campaign when the camera cuts away to Nixon, and Nixon is seen nodding as if he agrees with something that Kennedy is actually saying. So to the extent that the medium is the vehicle through which we see the debate, the candidates and the producers' capacities to reframe what we're seeing and experiencing can affect how we perceive it in ways that would be very different than, for example, if we were just sitting in a live auditorium.
Let me ask both of you, and I guess I'll start with Kathleen and go to Russ. Do these debates matter? Can you pick, if you had to pick a debate where it seemed to have an impact on the subsequent vote, which one would you pick, or which two or three?
I picked 76 because it's interesting and it's complex. The Frankel question of Ford.
For our viewers who might be younger than we are.
The press cast an answer by Gerald Ford in 76 to a question about Soviet domination of Eastern Europe as a gaffe. Max Frankel, the person who had raised the question and repeatedly followed it up, implied that it was a mistake on Ford's part. And people who watched the debate before they saw the media commentary afterwards made nothing of it. People who saw the media commentary after it perceived that it was problematic for Ford. Now, what that tells us is the media coverage of the debate, the media interpretation and framing of the debate can have an effect which is quite different than exposure from the debate itself. And the reason I would pick that as my example of a case in which it may have affected the outcome is Ford plateaued in the polls for the period immediately after the debate when he held his ground and said, I didn't make a mistake. He actually didn't. He'd articulated, although poorly, a policy that U.S. presidents had held over an extended period. That is, they refused to grant the Soviet Union's right to be in Eastern Europe. In that sense, saying that the Soviet Union did not dominate was saying, this is our policy, we won't grant it. And as the uprisings in Gdansk and as the outcomes in Poland ultimately illustrated, and Ford ultimately said, his position was vindicated historically. That is, what Ford was affirming was the rights of the peoples there to their own sovereignty. So what you see is he plateaued in the polls because he failed to apologize for something about which he wasn't wrong. That's potentially a media effect. But nonetheless, that plateauing when he was closing on Carter in the polls means that had he continued to close at the rate he was closing before that debate, he would have won that election.
Russ, can you think of one?
Well, I don't know if it was a complete game changer, but I think I'll just talk about the one that I think most familiar with was in 2012, where, if you remember the first debate between Mitt Romney and President Obama, it was widely accepted that, Obama did not bring his A game nor his B game, and possibly brought his C game. And Mitt was on fire. And Mitt had a very, very good, solid debate, and it really helped the campaign with momentum there, moving forward. Second debate, was kind of a push. Third debate was the foreign policy debate. And that was the one where Obama attacks Romney for saying that Russia is our greatest geopolitical foe, and says, with the 60s call, they want their foreign policy back. The 80s call, they want their foreign policy back. At the time, that was seen, Obama, just really handed it to Romney, and he did. I mean, we saw the momentum, any momentum that we had moving into that had stopped, and it was the last debate, so the campaign was really set. Because these debates are kind of like, there are a couple of big moments in campaigns. The conventions are one, nominating your vice president is another, and the debates are another, where there's a set piece, where from that, maybe the dynamic can change. And maybe it doesn't change completely the trajectory of the race, but what it does is it changes it for a while. And being the last debate, that really changed the direction. It seemed that Obama had gotten the upper hand on Romney in that last debate. And for the next 2.5, 3 weeks, then we had Hurricane Sandy. It was just starting for Romney to kind of start going down. And our polling showed that we were pretty tight and very, very competitive through that point. And then after that, we just were never kind of winning in the states that we needed to win it. We're never winning by enough anyway. So that would be the one that I would point to.
It's interesting. We have seen incumbent presidents. Sometimes they screw up their first debate. And I wonder if it's we had Obama, we had Bush. I think you could say Gerald Ford. I think you could probably say Jimmy Carter in his debate against Reagan.
Reagan in 84.
And Reagan, that's right, and Reagan in 84. I wonder what that is. Is it they feel like, look, I have so many other important things to do. Why do I have to sit here in this room with my aides for 2 days and answer questions? And, they probably resist doing the sort of debate prep that they should be doing.
Well, there's another, it is very different. When you're when you're in a campaign for a long period with a candidate, maybe even a governor or a senator or even a vice president over months and months, there's a familiarity that you have with them, that you back and forth in a give and take. And all of a sudden now you're not sitting with the guy who's the candidate or the woman who's the candidate who might have been a senator or a governor, but you're now sitting across from the president of the United States. And you're having to give the president of the United States, criticize his record, in a way that, they don't like to hear, that they're not used to hearing. And so I think you pull your punches. I think punches are pulled. And all of a sudden they're facing the candidate now, whose entire job is to, punch his opponent in the face as hard as he can. And I think that they're just not used to taking a punch. But what you see is often they recover from that in the second and then third debates.
Yeah. Kathleen, what do you think is going on now in the debate about to become tomorrow night? I mean, what do you think? How do you think each campaign is preparing to kind of do something that will change a little bit of the course of this campaign? It's been remarkably stable. I have there's a chart in a recent Brookings piece that I did that shows that from February 1st, 2020 to September 22nd, this race just hasn't moved very much. And when you think of all the dramatic things that have happened in between, a pandemic, Black Lives Matter, conventions, et cetera, it's the stability of the race is astonishing. So what could they hope to accomplish tomorrow night?
One of the things about the perspective that says there's remarkable stability is that's a national perspective, not a battleground state perspective. So the campaign isn't actually happening nationally. For practical purposes, it's focused on not simply battleground states, but battleground states where each campaign thinks there are voters who can either be persuaded or mobilized and demobilized to their advantage. And so while we talk in national terms and a debate is aired nationally for practical purpose, the question is, how is it going to be perceived in the battleground states? So the first question that one would ask in this environment is, what are the issues that matter most to those who are most persuasible in the battleground states that I need to mobilize voters up, demobilize voters down, or shift voters? And to what extent can I accomplish that by changing the issues on which they focus to my advantage? And because the debate moderator in the first debate sets the topics, that means framing within topics already preset by Chris Wallace. The second thing to remember is that we're in an environment in which the votes are being cast right now in most states now. You are able to think not about what am I going to be doing on November 3rd, but when am I going to cast the ballot I either have or have not received. Where in the past, debates couldn't really affect outcome because messaging usually creates short-term impacts. And the last debate happened long before the person actually casted a vote on election day. We're now in an environment in which the ballot could be cast right after the debate. That is, you may have it in hand, decide to fill it out that night. So we have a greater capacity to create debate impact than we have in past years. There was a greater capacity in 2016 than in 2012, et cetera, because we've had more early voting. And we're going to have historic levels of early voting this year. So I would say that although the percent of undecideds on average looks substantially lower than 2016, the question becomes, does the proximity of the debate to the voting decision increase the likelihood that those who will vote are going to be influenced by the content? And then from a candidate's perspective, are they addressing the issues that matter? That is, focusing on things that if you focus on it, you're more likely to vote for that candidate, can shape those votes that are about to be cast.
You know, last night there was some pretty bombshell news, which I was watching the football game, so I wasn't paying much attention to it. I'd put my phone away and everything. And I woke up this morning to see that Trump's tax returns are finally out. How are they going to play that? I mean, will that become the first question tonight, Russ?
You would think so. You would think that Chris Wallace will ask that out of the box, and you would think that President Trump will have an answer to that. I mean, they were talking about that a little bit yesterday. He's a complicated businessman, and I have a lot of investments, and this is what businessmen do. With President Trump, you start to, the normal rules don't seem to apply. The normal rules of kind of, gravity and political, political rules don't seem to be part of it. He'll have an answer. Biden will attack him for it. They'll go back and forth on it, and it'll come out kind of a wash, I think, at the end. I think it'll be just to depend upon, are people, as Kathleen said, are people at home in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Florida, are they going to feel offended in some way that, that they pay a lot more in taxes than the president of the United States does, who is theoretically a billionaire? Yeah. And so it may not be quite in the back and forth that we'll see on the stage, but in kind of how it's framed and how people, I don't even really want to say, not how they think about it, but really truly how they feel about it. How does it make, and I think to Kathleen's point, I think that there's a lot of voters who are having that ballot, and they're going to say, okay, I made up my mind. Biden's the guy. I made up my mind. Trump's the guy. I think those early deciders, might be influenced by that first debate to confirm their choice. But boy, I think there's going to be a bunch of people who are going to say, yeah, I'm going to wait for the second debate. yeah, I'll wait for that third debate. And then kind of the late deciders in this, and people who will be mailing in their ballots, towards the last week when they feel like the game has been played. It's sort of like football. I mean, do you call it in the first quarter or in the fourth quarter? You're probably watching the Patriots, so you always have to wait for the fourth quarter.
Always, yes, as a Patriots fan, yes. But the other interesting thing about those late deciders, to the extent that there are many, is that those late deciders in a couple campaigns really were impacted by the debates. A lot of people think that in 1980, Jimmy Carter had a shot at holding on to his presidency, but they scheduled that debate so late in the game. It was October 29th. I think maybe, Kathleen, that was the latest presidential debate ever. And because it was so late, and because Ronald Reagan managed to switch the narrative on himself and was not a scary warmonger, but this nice avuncular man, that seems to have had a real impact on the subsequent election. I'm not sure that any of the other debates had that kind of clear-cut impact. Kathleen, can you think of any that might have fallen in that category?
Well, one of the things that we look at is, are you able to study it well enough to answer the question? So the difficulty historically has been, how do you locate the audience that was going to watch the debate, and as a result study it? And then how do you locate the audience that was exposed to the press coverage afterwards and study it? And how do you find the electorate that both watched the debate and watched the coverage afterwards? You can't parse those things out very readily. And to the extent that the interpretation frames the debate and you watch the debates through a channel that provides interpretation, it's very difficult to separate those. So whenever people ask the question, can you know if, under what circumstances, my answer is, academically, we will never, I think, have a method underlying what it is we do to answer that with the kind of certainty that we can answer some other kinds of questions. We can say that debate exposure does change attitudes that we have been able to track. But then you're studying how people project they vote based on that. You don't know how they actually voted. So, for example, in the book Cyber War, How Russian Trolls and Hackers Helped Elect a President, which is now out in second edition, I argue that those who watched the debate, the second and third debates, compared to those who didn't watch the debates, when you're controlling for everything else, are more likely to say that Hillary Clinton says one thing in public and another in private. In each of those debates, that issue was raised using Russian hacked, illegally gotten Democratic content as the basis for the question. And in each case, that hacked content was taken out of context. Hillary Clinton did not tell Wall Street bankers, I have a public and private position. Hillary Clinton did not say, I stand for open trade and open borders. In the first case, she was talking about a Lincoln Spielberg film. In the second case, it was a part of a sentence talking about a hemisphere common market dealing with open trade, open borders sometime in the future. And then the rest of the sentence talks about energy. So we see in those two debates a changed perception of whether she says one thing in public and another in private. And those who have that changed perception say that they are more likely to vote for Donald Trump rather than Hillary Clinton. Now, notice all the inferences I have to go through to say that debate exposure appeared to have changed that attitude, which then projects to a different vote. I believe that mattered in a close election. Can I establish it conclusively? No.
Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the quickest ways to understand this is to say, in a close election, everything matters. And in a landslide, nothing matters. So we're always trying to, parse out what is it? Before we take some audience questions, I want to get from each of you, what's Trump got to do tomorrow night to try to catch up with Biden, and what does Biden have to do to hold on to what looks like a hold, looks like a lead, and including in the battleground states, because we've been seeing lots of polling in battleground states too. What's their goal when the debate is over? What headline do they want? Russ?
So I'll go back to my hot debate, cold debate analogy. I'm sure that if you're in Trump debate prep, they're saying we want a hot debate. You're good and hot. You do better. A cool sort of kind of sleepy Donald Trump showing up to a debate would not be good. He's going to prosecute his case against Joe Biden. He's going to throw out, my guess is he throws out, his 40-year political career, his family, I mean, anything that he can think of to kind of try to rattle Biden, because he wants to mix it up. And so the story becomes anything but Donald Trump and his taxes, Donald Trump and, his and the coronavirus. I mean, make it about something else. You don't like the way the conversation is going, change it. Kind of the famous line. He's going to want to be, and he's a master of that. He does that probably better than anyone in changing the conversation and wanting to try to get Biden to kind of chase him down that rabbit hole. Biden, on the other hand, he probably is more on the side of a cooler debate. He wants to project himself as being a president, project himself as kind of, his weakness is, can he stand up there for the period of time and take the questions? Is he articulate? Is he able? Does he seem like he still has it at 77 years of age? I mean, you look at those Reagan clips, and Reagan in '84, I believe he was 72 at the time.
Yeah.
And now we have a candidate for president who's 5 years older than that. So my guess is they want a cool debate. I don't think you're going to get a headline either way unless something unforeseen happens that is going to be determinative in any kind of big way. I think Trump supporters will think that their guy did well. I think Biden supporters think that their guy did well. I think there'll be a few people on the margin that, maybe sitting at home with a scorecard trying to figure out, who to vote for. But my guess is that that they still wait a little bit longer.
Yeah, let me reframe the question. I think that each candidate should want to ensure that voters do not vote based on misinformation about their actual positions. And I think we ought to want no voter to vote based on misinformation about positions. So on those things that are consequential to a vote, we want the debate to clarify so that people actually know what the candidates have done and say they will do. What that means is that deceptions about the extent to which and whom will be taxed by Joe Biden needs to be clarified for Biden. It means defunding the police needs to be clarified. So you've got deceptions in the Trump ads about who will be taxed and the extent and on what he will do in relationship to funding and policing. He needs to clarify so that voters don't based on misperception. On the Republican side, there's confusion about the Trump position on Social Security and Medicare that's being magnified in ads by the Democrats that are trying to increase the likelihood that you think, which is what traditionally Democrats argue about Republicans, that Donald Trump in his second term will destroy Social Security and Medicare. So what you need to do for Donald Trump's standpoint is if that's not what he intends to do, clarify, make it really, really clear. Voters tend to be deceived by believing the things that they believe about party and not thinking critically and looking carefully at what's actually in the record. So about Democrats, we think they're going to increase taxes. So the deception will say more than they are and on more people than they are to a greater extent than they are. We believe Republicans are going to not protect social programs as well. They'll cut the rate of increase in the usual terms, or in the Democratic phrasing of it, they'll actually cut the social programs. So the Republicans need to establish when they do not have that intent that they are not going to do it. And what that means is they also need to be on the record, because one important function of debates is giving the mass audience a preview in the form of clear statements of what the candidate will do in governance. If a candidate stands on the debate stage and says, I will not, then we take that as a national promise that he, in this case, will act on as president. And so that clarity is important for a second reason. The first is not having misinformed voting. But the second is that the electorate as a whole deserves to know how campaigning forecasts governance. And to the extent that it does, it indicates that we have a representative process, that you are able to vote based on good information that yields an outcome, whether you like it or not, that you could have foreseen, because the debates helped you build a context of understanding what the candidates would actually do. The public doesn't really realize the extent to which candidates for president try aggressively to keep their promises. When a candidate says, I'm going to do it, says it clearly on a national stage, the likelihood that as president, he will try. He may not be able to accomplish it because he may not have control of Congress, but he will try to accomplish that end. And that makes debates important because they increase learning and tying campaigning governance.
Yeah, you know, this reminds me, Kathleen, and I think I'll send this to you, of one of the questions that's come in from one of our viewers. And it relates to, of course, fact checking. And Kathleen, as many of you know, is the creator of factcheck.org.
Co-founder. Brooks Jackson gets half the credit.
Okay, sorry about that. Is there any way to introduce real-time fact-checking of candidate responses for accuracy? Should this be considered? Now, you guys do some of that. Explain what you do, and maybe could it be done even more real time?
Now, I'm going to take this and bounce it right to Russ. The one time that it was clearly done in a presidential debate in real time, it was done poorly. Candy Crowley inaccurately fact-checked Romney, and that disadvantaged Romney, and that was unfair. One reason that we should minimize the likelihood that we do it on the fly is that it's very difficult in extemporaneous speech to lock down clearly what is said and to get right what it is you're saying in response. That doesn't mean that we can't anticipate what candidates will say, because they tend actually to reiterate a whole lot of their past deceptions. Fact check it in advance and have those statements up there available, particularly for those dual screening, watching a fact checking stream as they're watching the debate, to check. But I'm very leery about checking in real time because of that experience with the Romney-Obama debate, and I think Russ should give us some commentary about that.
Sure. I remember that. Not particularly fondly, but it was. But listen, Governor Romney at the time, Governor Romney was, too much of a gentleman and too much in the kind of plays by the rules kind of candidate. I think what you'd see now, though, is that we saw this in the debate. The primary debates in 2012, where Newt Gingrich goes after Juan Williams as the moderator and the questioner. So if I'm Trump, if I'm Chris Wallace tomorrow night, and I decide that I'm going to step in and fact check Donald Trump, Trump isn't going to disagree and say, "Oh, thank you, Chris, for reminding me of I was wrong there." He's going to attack Chris Wallace. This is just another clear example of the fake news media putting their thumb on the scale. And this is exactly why you can't listen to these people. You can't listen to this guy over here. Listen to me. I know what I'm talking about. And so the fact check in real time, I think, becomes particularly live and by the moderator is just fraught with danger to just turn this into a 2-on-1 debate between the moderator, the Democratic candidate, and Donald Trump. And in some ways, Trump would like nothing more than to debate on the moderator, because then he kind of leaves Biden off on the side, kind of trying to figure out what to say. So I think I don't know the answer to it. I think that, I think Kathleen brings up good points, and having things that are prepackaged, having things that are kind of immediately when the debate is over with, to have things that are part of the spin and the reporting afterwards. But real time, I think, is going to be very, very difficult.
That's really good. That's really good. Thank you. Remember, questions can come in over the chat box, or can come in over Twitter. I do have a question from Nancy Kirk in the audience. How does body language affect the viewers, affect the perception that the viewers have?
Largely, we interpret our candidate through a favorable lens, and the candidate we oppose through an unfavorable one. So when people frame questions in terms of what is the objective meaning of something, how do you create a universal context of understanding, it's just not the way communication works. So while I might look at Donald Trump moving in on Hillary Clinton's space, standing behind her as his being strong and competent, alternatively, I might look at it as stalking. So I can tell you which of those perceptions is more likely to be the perception of the Democrat, which is more likely to be the perception of the Republican Trump supporter. The the cue has to be fairly clear in its own right and fairly telegraphic to have a universal meaning. There are moments in which you worry a lot about the interpretation that people put on things, and as a result, people start to see them through that interpretation of others. That moment you showed where George Bush is looking at his watch is one of those. That is often interpreted as evidence that George Bush was just out of touch in the debate. Let me give you an alternative. Bill Clinton was talking at great length, and he was looking down to try to find out when was Clinton going to end. So you also have in the Kennedy-Nixon debates, there's a clock off to the side. Nixon looks off to the clock periodically. One interpretation is he's shifty-eyed. Another is he's looking off to the clock at the side. Nixon perspires profusely during the debates. That's genetic. That means that your ancestors way back married other ancestors way back, were prone to sweating under hot lights. And over time, that genetic pool of selectivity gave you someone who's more likely to perspire on hot lights. The idea that suggested that he was under stress and as a result wasn't handling it well is simply runs in defiance of what we know about how biology works. So the danger is that we take telegraphic cues to mean something that they don't, or that we take the interpretation of someone else about what they mean uncritically, or that we simply process through our own partisan lens and we don't see it for what it is. I try to set most of those things aside as a result to the extent possible, because they're so fraught.
You know, Elaine, you take a look at, you mentioned the Gore-Bush debate in 2000, where Gore was caught grimacing and sighing and stalking Bush. And there was that famous, moment where Gore kind of approaches Bush, and Bush looks at him, kind of nods his head and acknowledges him and kind of pushes him back. For years after that, in debate prep, it was like, don't do what Al Gore did. Don't do that. You don't want to do that. The camera's always on you. Kind of look down, take notes. Don't encroach upon your opponent. In that same year, in 2000, there was the famous, not at the presidential level, but at a Senate campaign, the famous debate between Rick Lazio and Hillary Clinton, where Lazio gives Hillary a pledge to sign and walks over to the podium and kind of, seems like he's like hectoring her to kind of sign it. Seems clearly a bad moment for Lazio in that debate. And then in 2016, along comes Trump and literally breaks every single one of those rules. Is grimacing, is sighing, is making faces, is talking over the person, is stalking them. And yet that doesn't seem, that seems to, work for him. So, and I think that what you say is that I do think that viewers, we know how more than anything to look. We may not know how to. We may not read as much anymore. We may not, analyze as much anymore. But we are consumers of video like never before, and generations younger than us are entirely consumers of video. Mm-hmm. And so they kind of know, and they pick up video cues much, quite a bit. We all do, and younger generations even more so. So I think that if you just feel comfortable, if you seem as comfortable, Trump seemed comfortable doing that. And therefore voters kind of look at that and say, okay, he is who he is. And if you like him, you kind of like him because of that, not in spite of it.
Hillary Clinton in an interview recently discussed that debate episode for a long time, and discussed her, I don't know if you saw this, Kathleen, or not, discussed what was going on in her head. She knew he was looming behind her. She felt it was a kind of threatening, inappropriate presence, but she never did know what to do. Should she have turned around and said, back off, buddy? Get away from me. What are you doing? Or can I do something for you? It was interesting because when Al Gore invaded George Bush's space, George Bush sort of just looked at him and said, can I help? Did he say, can I help you?
Can I help you, buddy?
Yeah, can I help you, buddy? Which had the effect of pushing Gore away and stopping and making it look like Bush was standing up for himself. So it was it was an interesting moment that obviously Hillary Clinton is still wondering what she should have done.
But there's something else that's happening there. By virtue of Donald Trump doing that, he distracted Hillary Clinton. Part of her cognitive capacity is now dealing with the looming presence of a gigantic, potentially menacing male standing behind her, which means that she does not have all of the strategic resources available to focus on the audience member she's supposed to be answering. And so to the extent that you're giving cues to the audience member because you're responding to a question, he's actually accomplishing something. He's disadvantaging his opponent substantially, which is why we ought to have rules that govern this, and the moderator ought to enforce those rules. The moderator ought to have said, excuse me, I want to stop for a moment. Candidate Trump, please get back over where you're supposed to be. Now, Madam Secretary, let's take that question again. Also, to the extent that the press becomes our way of seeing these things, the press displaces our ability to understand. Things move into short-term memory, and then they disappear if we don't move into long-term memory. Every minute that was spent talking about Trump sniffing through the debate, remember Trump sniffs or snorts in microphones, or Al Gore sighing, was not a moment in the post-debate commentary that helped clarify the candidates' issue distinctions. If we come out of these debates and the public that is subject to the cap on deductions of state and local taxes doesn't realize that there's a difference between these two candidates and what they would do about the deduction of state and local taxes, then that's a significant lapse in the journalist activities. So journalists, if you focus us on that, first, we're not moving the issue knowledge we got into long-term memory. The important things that might matter to us in voting aren't moving into long-term memory. Shame on you. But secondly, important time that you could spend focusing and reinforcing issue distinctions or indicating what wasn't asked and answered, but to which you know an answer, is also being squandered.
Well, we've got one final question here, but it's a doozy, and it comes from the audience. And the question is, have most voters made up their minds for who to vote for, including the undecided voters, which is a really good question. If everybody's made up their minds, do these matter? Russ?
Haley Barbour, Governor Barbour used to have this, we did some work for him, and he used to have this great phrase. He'd say, tell me what the ballot test is among the undecideds. And what he meant by that was, and you saw this in 4 years ago, is that among those people who are unfavorable to both candidates, Trump won that number. So I want to take a look at who the undecideds are and what is the fave on faves of each of the candidates among the undecideds. And that pretty much gives me an idea of kind of where they may break on election day. Listen, I think there are fewer and fewer undecideds. I think that there was a poll that came out recently that said that only 28, it was the lowest ever, only 28% of the electorate was looking to the debates to make their decision in this campaign, which was down, I think, at least 10 points over the last few years, which means that the pool of undecideds is becoming smaller and smaller. And I think what you're going to be wanting to look at is which candidate has a higher favorable among those people who are undecided going into the last weeks of this campaign. And as we see that, I think that could be more. And then that along with, who's motivating their base, which is what this is all about. Is Donald Trump able to get, higher numbers of white, non-college educated voters in the Midwest and kind of bump that number up by a couple of points? Is Joe Biden able to get more African-American voters in the Philadelphia area out in order to win Pennsylvania? Those are the things I think most of these campaigns are going to be looking at.
Kathleen?
Yeah, tell me that you voted reliably in the past. Tell me that across that time, you've always voted for Republican, you've always voted for a Democrat, and I don't need much more information other than whether you're going to vote. If you've voted in the past, the likelihood you will is extremely high. The people who are more susceptible to influence are those who aren't as tightly anchored to party. They're not as tightly anchored to voting at all, and they're not as consistently voting for one party when they have across the past. And to the extent that they feel ambivalence about both candidates, they're not already anchored in party. The question is, are they going to vote at all? First question, and Russ is featuring that question. So can I mobilize or demobilize them to my advantage? And then secondly, how do I increase the likelihood that they are focused on issues that matter to them, on which my position is consistent with what they want a president to do, framed in a way that leads them to believe that I will act in their self-interest and that I share their values? If I can communicate those two things among the pool that are susceptible, I'll increase the likelihood on the margin that they'll tilt in my favor. The most people in the election are already decided in most elections, just out of the box. But you have capacities within those who aren't as anchored by party and are feeling ambivalence and don't have the solid history of voting in a particular way, and not a solid history of voting in general, to shape influence. And that's potentially where this matters. Those people, however, are less likely to be viewing debates. So they're more likely to be influenced by whatever happens downstream of the debates in forms of the memes or the clips or the things that circulate within their media spheres. It's important that mainstream news, to the extent that it can, break through that with good information about legitimate distinctions between candidates that will forecast governance.
And it's true. After the debate tomorrow night, there won't be just the debate. There will be articles and clips and news stories and people sending things on Facebook about what was said in the debate, et cetera. There'll be an enormous amount of post-debate information going out there to try and affect the voters. I want to thank Kathleen. You are a wonderful scholar, a prodigious scholar. You make me feel totally insecure all the time when I just look at the amount of stuff you can put out in a year. And of course, factcheck.org is doing a great job. Congratulations with that. Russ, your list of candidates and your list of experience all over the country is truly overwhelming. And I hope you have some good candidates this year too, because I know you always do, and you always do a great job for them. And to our viewers, thank you very much for joining us. And I hope that this little session will help you, if you choose, to join in tomorrow night and have a look at the first presidential debate. And maybe come back and tell us, does it matter? Thanks so much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.